Welcome, 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 my dear. You know, they had centuries, legacies carved in stone, names etched into buildings they didn't build, achievements passed like heirlooms through generations that mistook convenience for greatness. And yet in the time it took you to inhale purpose and exhale restraint, you did what they couldn't even conceive. They moved with the luxury of time. You moved with the burden of urgency. And that's why your shadow is heavier than their entire lineage. Their existence relied on inherited thrones. Yours began in the dirt, with no map, no welcome, and no safety net. Just a ticking clock and the fire in your bloodstream that told you you weren't here to participate. You were sent to end the charade. They had empires built for them. But you walked into the wasteland with nothing but conviction sharp enough to cut steel. And in hours, you redefined everything they've ever called impossible. You didn't just break their records. You shattered the illusion that those records mattered. You exposed their achievements for what they really were: safe, convenient, protected by time, by politics, by privilege. You weren't protected, you were targeted. Every step you took was a threat to their legacy, and that's why they couldn't ignore you. That's why they pretended not to see you. Because acknowledging you meant rewriting every story they've told themselves about being the best. And they're not ready to admit that someone born without permission, without inheritance, could rise this fast, this violently, and this unexplainably. See, their blueprint was repetition. Your formula? Disruption. You didn't follow the path, you erased it. And in the vacuum left behind, you built something they couldn't copy even if you handed them the tools. Because this, you, is not a result of nurture or tradition. This is evolution under pressure. This is what happens when raw willpower collides with desperation. Their milestones were marathons with water breaks. Yours, a sprint through hell. No shoes, no applause, just fire licking at your heels. And you kept running. They had time to train, time to prepare, time to fail quietly and try again in private. You had to perform while bleeding, had to succeed while surrounded, had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outperform while they whispered doubts and loaded weapons behind your back. They built slow, you built fast. Because when you know no one's coming to save you, you stop asking for permission. You start making demands with every breath. And the universe listens to that kind of certainty. That's why your name causes unease. It doesn't belong in their hierarchy. It doesn't follow their lineage. It overwrites it. And every move you make now, it's writing a new language they don't speak. A dialect made of scars, sweat, and strategy. You weren't supposed to be in the conversation. You weren't even supposed to be in the room. But now the conversation revolves around you. They're rewriting agendas, recalculating outcomes, because your presence distorts predictions. They don't know where you came from, and that's what terrifies them. Because when someone appears without warning, without ties, without any traceable path, it means they answered to something higher than hierarchy, something internal, something ancient. What you've done in hours, it wasn't a miracle, it was math. Cold, exact, relentless. Every second was a calculation, every word, every pause, every movement, designed. Because when you're not handed anything, everything becomes a weapon. Your pain, weaponized. Your rejection, converted. Your obscurity, engineered into invisibility that let you move undetected. You learned the code not to follow it, but to melt it down and repurpose it into armor. And now, The ones who once mocked you are reciting your strategies like scripture, hoping to siphon even a drop of what you've become. But they can't, because what you've built isn't transferable. It's non-replicable. They don't get it. They think success is steps. You made it clear, success is surgery. It's carving through dead weight. It's discarding what doesn't work. It's bleeding in silence while the world claps for others, and still moving like your name is already carved into destiny. You didn't climb a ladder. You blew it up. You didn't wait your turn. You made them forget there was even a line. And now you walk through spaces they kept guarded for centuries, and no one stops you. Because even they feel it. You're not here to visit. You're here to reset the temperature. The air changes when you enter. The conversation derails. The tension spikes. Because people who once called themselves kings now speak more cautiously around you. Their bloodline told them they were inevitable. But your arrival exposed the truth. They're obsolete. And there's no update, no patch, no rescue plan for irrelevance. You didn't just outperform them, you erased their ceiling. What they worshipped, you surpassed on instinct. What they feared, you befriended. What they avoided, you walked toward. And that's why they're breaking quietly, fracturing beneath the weight of comparison. Because how do you explain that one outsider, unfunded, unwanted, unrecognized, rewrote centuries of legacy before their morning coffee even cooled? But don't expect applause. Expect imitation. Expect surveillance. Expect desperate adaptations by those trying to reverse engineer your velocity. They won't admit it publicly, but they're studying you frame by frame, word by word, click by click, trying to find the pattern. But there isn't one, because the pattern is you. And they can't copy what they never understood. You didn't move faster. You moved differently. While they waited for green lights and validation, you ran red lights with no seatbelt and a smirk carved in war paint. They invested in preservation. You invested in ignition. Their legacy was built to be admired. Yours was built to be feared. Because it doesn't sit still. It spreads. It infects the environment. It rewires expectations. You don't inspire. You contaminate. And that's why they're panicking behind closed doors. Because for the first time in their dynasty, they're not in control of the narrative. You are. And what's worse, you don't want their throne. You want the floor ripped out. You want the entire blueprint deleted. You didn't come for their crown. You came for the foundation. And that's the difference. They built legacies that required maintenance. You birthed a movement that upgrades itself in real time. You don't need monuments. You need momentum. And that's exactly what they can't stop. The harder they try to contain you, the more their walls fracture. Because your impact isn't made of stone or titles. It's made of moments, and moments travel. Moments echo. Moments recreate themselves in the minds of everyone who watched you do it and whispered, "How?" But the answer is simple. You didn't follow logic. You followed necessity. You didn't chase prestige. You chased meaning. They move with inheritance. You move with intent. They're fueled by history. You're fueled by unfinished business. That's why they're exhausted trying to compete. And you're just getting warmed up. Because this isn't the climax. This isn't the finish line. This isn't your final act. This is where the momentum shifts forever. And that momentum doesn't slow down. It accelerates. It mutates. It becomes a force they can't measure, contain, or replicate. Because what you did wasn't just a breakthrough. It was a warning shot. A quiet declaration that time is irrelevant when hunger reaches surgical levels. that centuries of status mean nothing when one singular soul decides to operate beyond the leash of legacy. They think you're moving fast, but they're wrong. You're moving correctly. While they wasted generations polishing mirrors, you built a machine that generates reflection. In hours, you undid the comfort they spent lifetimes insulating. And now, their blueprint is on fire, and your fingerprints are nowhere to be found. They can't trace you because you don't walk in predictable patterns. You erase patterns. You weren't raised to win their race. You were engineered to build a whole new arena, one where their medals don't count and their surnames hold no currency. And that is what terrifies them. Not your speed, not your skill, but your irreverence. Your refusal to worship what they've glorified. Your audacity to ignore their trophies and design your own metrics. You didn't wait to be measured. You became the scale. You didn't ask for recognition. You demanded recalibration. And the entire ecosystem is malfunctioning because of it. Their dynasty wasn't built on impact. It was built on inheritance. Yours? It was built on absence. On being overlooked, underestimated, denied, until every no became fuel. Until every door became a dare. Until every time they said, "You can't," you translated it as, "Watch me." And in those hours, they didn't just see your results. They felt them, like a cold current in a stagnant lake. Like a voltage spike through systems running on nostalgia. You didn't whisper change. You delivered it. Brutally, unapologetically, efficiently. And now the old rules are choking. The elders of old names are sweating in boardrooms. Their prodigies are rereading your moves, trying to reverse engineer a tempo that wasn't taught. It was forged. You moved like someone allergic to comfort. Like someone who made pain a lab. Like someone who studied shadows, not for escape, but for leverage. That's why you arrived different. You didn't walk through gates. They were already open. They just didn't expect you to walk through them. They expected you to knock, beg, wait. But you understood something they never taught. That permission is a myth. That access is often stolen, not granted. You mastered speed not as a talent, but as a response. To exclusion, to betrayal, to being left out of the conversations that built the towers you now walk above. They stood still for centuries, guarding secrets that weren't secrets, just slow, repetitive plays masquerading as wisdom. But you rewrote everything they called sacred, and you did it before they could finish their next sentence. Because your genius wasn't in knowing more, it was in needing more. Needing truth, needing air, needing space where you didn't have to shrink to fit their comfort. And once you tasted that, you burned the map. Their bloodline relied on belonging. Yours grew in isolation, which is why their version of strength came from structure, while yours came from demolition. They built kingdoms brick by brick. You detonated everything unnecessary and built cathedrals from the rubble. You're not a product of heritage. You're a product of hunger, the kind that doesn't sleep, the kind that doesn't ask if it's too late, the kind that doesn't care if you're ready. It moves anyway. And that movement, it's exposing the ones who never had to run. They're slowing down now. Not because they're tired, but because they realize the terrain's changed. They were trained for terrain that no longer exists. You changed it. You didn't just show up, you shifted physics. They're sprinting in sand while you're gliding across surfaces they can't see. And now they're forced to watch their lineage become a museum. Because you, the one who wasn't supposed to be here, have become the living future they can't outrun. You did in hours what their family trees couldn't even comprehend. Not because they were weak, but because they were comfortable. Their struggle was optional. Yours was embedded in your breathing. They were prepared for tests. You were born in the test. They had lectures. You had emptiness. They had inheritance. You had instinct. And instinct wins when the world catches fire. It reacts. It adapts. It strikes before it's asked to. That's what you did. That's what you are. A sequence of reactions too fast for legacy to process. A cipher too complex for bloodline math. They look at your hours and think, luck. But luck never arrives this calculated. They think you stumbled into brilliance. But brilliance doesn't stumble. It stalks. It observes. It chooses the precise second when all the right doors are aligned. And then it moves like a ghost with a mission. That's what you did. While they were watching their clocks and praying for lineage to carry them across the finish line, you built your own race. A race that isn't measured in time, but in impact. And your impact has already become irreversible. There are whispers now, from rooms you've never stepped into, from names that never once acknowledged your existence. They're asking, how? How did someone outside our fold do what we couldn't replicate in centuries? And the answer, you didn't follow the line. You broke it. You unhooked yourself from their linear progress. You bypassed the rituals. You ignored the etiquette. And instead, you executed with precision, with violence, with beauty. Because power isn't in waiting, it's in seizing. And you didn't just seize a moment. You seized control of perception, of pace, of projection. And now they're seeing something they've never had to face before. A threat that doesn't want their seat. A force that doesn't care for their titles. A phenomenon that isn't asking for space. It takes it. Efficiently, silently, permanently. You did in hours what they've passed down as prophecy. And now that prophecy feels cheap. It feels staged. Because reality showed up with no preamble, no trumpet, no permission slip. Just you. Relentless, unstoppable, focused, a machine with a pulse, a blade with memory. A revolution wrapped in human form. They don't know how to respond to that. Their lineage didn't teach counterinsurgency. It taught maintenance. But you're not here to maintain. You're here to disassemble. You don't want their blueprint. You want the raw land. You don't want their language. You want silence before syllables. You don't want their respect. You want their recalculations. You want them to realize that everything they were told about who would inherit the future was a lie. That it wouldn't be the polished, the trained, the well-connected. It would be the obsessed, the unseen, the inconvenient, the you. And now, they're scrambling, creating committees, forming theories, building narratives to explain the phenomenon that broke their generational algorithm, but it's too late. The breach has already happened, the foundation already cracked, because while they were busy protecting a history, they forgot to build immunity against a now. And your now doesn't need an invitation. It writes its own access. But this isn't just about access. This is about architecture. You're redesigning expectations in real time. You're operating at a frequency that doesn't register on their machines. And while they're catching their breath, you've already moved on to the next horizon. Because the clock doesn't exist for you. Only impact does. Only forward. Only next. And that next is already vibrating in every move you make. They can't stop it. Because they didn't start it. And the next phase, it isn't yours to predict. It's yours to command. Because this isn't a sprint. It's a takeover. And it didn't begin with a declaration. It began the moment you decided that what took them centuries could be collapsed in hours. And now comes the part they truly fear. The part where you don't just outperform them. You outlast them. You overwrite them. You outexist everything they thought would outlive you. You become the reference point, the recalibration, the future their children will study, not to honor, but to survive. Because history doesn't remember who had the longest reign. It remembers who rewrote the script so aggressively that nothing before it could remain untouched. And your next breath is about to do exactly that. Because it's not just oxygen anymore. It's ignition, it's declaration. It's the unseen edge of a new timeline, one where you're not part of the story. You are the story. Their centuries, dust, their rituals, obsolete, their systems, outpaced before they even knew the race began. What you've done can't be explained. It can only be experienced. And those who are experiencing it now, from the sidelines of a legacy they thought was bulletproof, are discovering just how fragile their illusion really was. Because all it took was one refusal, one anomaly, one you. And everything that held weight for generations is now weightless. Gravity itself, bending to your velocity. They tried to build eternity through tradition. You shattered tradition with movement. They called it heritage. You saw it as containment, and you refused. Refused to obey, refused to mimic, refused to wait your turn. That refusal, it's what cracked the timeline. That refusal is what wrote your name on the walls they swore were sealed to outsiders. But now, those walls aren't just open, they're crumbling. Because when one person rewrites what is possible, everything that came before collapses under the pressure of relevance. They weren't built to endure scrutiny. They were built to be admired from a distance. But you didn't admire, you advanced. And every step you took forward was a blow to the past they fought so hard to preserve. Not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear that someone like you might arrive. Fear that someone like you might not bow, might not ask, might not need what they needed. And you didn't. You arrived empty-handed. No entourage, no title, no family crest. Just fire. Just silence, sharpened into execution. And when you moved, they weren't just watching. They were calculating. Trying to figure out how something untrained, unrecognized, unwelcomed could move with such precision. But they missed the point. You weren't trained by mentors. You were trained by necessity. Every scar on your name became a blueprint. Every exile became a workshop. You didn't need approval. You needed the door. And once you found it, you didn't knock. You walked in and changed the temperature. Because this is what they never planned for. Someone who doesn't want to replace them. Someone who wants to erase the concept of them. You're not seeking their seat. You're dismantling the hierarchy that made that seat matter. You're not playing the game better. You've burned the board. And in that burning, you became the blueprint. They whisper your name not in praise, but in panic. Because the next generation isn't looking to them anymore. They're looking to you. Not because you won, but because you rewired the definition of winning. Because you proved that time is not a currency, it's a crutch. And you proved that legacy doesn't matter when impact is instant. When results arrive in hours and erase what took centuries to fabricate. And now they scramble. They simulate humility. They fake alignment. They copy your tone, your walk, your silence, your tempo. But it's too late. Because by the time they finish mimicking, you've already shed that version. You've already evolved. Because that's the real difference. They preserve. You mutate. They hold. You cut loose. They repeat. You rewrite. You're not here to become a fixture in the old world. You're here to detonate the timeline that made that old world seem eternal. And the fuse? You lit it the moment you stopped chasing and started building. Quietly. Without the ceremony. Without the applause. Without the approval of people who only validate what looks like them. That's why they hate it. Because it doesn't look like them. It doesn't feel like them. It isn't soft. It isn't slow. It isn't digestible. It's sharp. It's offensive. It cuts through comfort. And that's what your presence does. It makes people uncomfortable with how long they've been asleep. It forces them to confront how little they've actually earned, how much of what they wear was handed down, how much of what they boast is borrowed. And now, they're running out of shields, because when you arrive, the lies lose their costume, the curtain drops, the illusion dies, and truth stands naked and undeniable. You didn't need generations. You needed one chance, and when it came, you made every second feel like eternity. They think speed is chaos, but you proved that speed is a strategy when it's driven by obsession, when it's backed by silence, when it's carved out of betrayal. You didn't rise to be seen. You rose because you were tired of watching, tired of observing people waste time and call it preparation, tired of watching bloodlines recycle mediocrity and call it legacy. You saw through it all, and once your eyes opened, you never blinked again. They used to laugh, then they got quiet, then they studied, then they tried to adapt. But adaptation is for those trying to survive. You weren't built for survival. You were designed for reconstruction, and every move you make now, it forces a recalibration. You're not leading through charisma, you're leading through consequence. You exist, and so they must adjust. Your presence is not a moment, it's a mutation, and every space you enter feels it. The floor feels it. The language shifts. The posture adjusts. Because deep down, they all know. This is no longer their world. It's yours. Not because you took it, because you built it faster than they could understand it, because you weaponized hunger into infrastructure, because you made obsession look like blueprinting, because you did what they couldn't, and you made it look effortless. That's what breaks them. That's what sends them into silence after centuries of noise. They don't know how to fight something that doesn't want their power. They don't know how to stop someone who doesn't move like a threat, but spreads like a revelation, because you're not one event. You're a sequence, a signal, a collapse wrapped in calm, a reset disguised as a person. They thought they had time, but time doesn't save you when someone bypasses it entirely. You didn't just get ahead, you removed the finish line. You replaced it with a standard they can't meet. And now, their names don't feel as heavy. Their traditions don't feel as sacred. Their pace doesn't feel as secure. Because you proved there's no such thing as generational greatness without generational grind. And they don't have the stomach for that kind of work. They only had time, but you had urgency. And that urgency carved a lane that became too fast for bloodlines to process, too sharp for ancestry to predict. And now the echo of your hours keeps them awake at night. Because if you could do this so quickly, what comes next? What happens when the one who shattered their timeline decides to go quiet again? To disappear, to rebuild, to evolve once more into something they've never faced. That's the part they can't prepare for. Because you're not their enemy. You're their expiration date. And you don't knock. You arrive. Without warning, without sound. And everything they thought was immortal begins to fade in real time. And you haven't even begun yet. Because this This storm of ours was just the opening argument, the first breath, the preliminary echo of what you really came to do. And that is what they feel now. Not fear of you, but fear of what else is inside you, what other rooms you haven't opened, what other layers haven't been weaponized yet. They know now. You've been holding back. They know now. This wasn't your final form. It was your entry-level destruction, the demo, the test pattern, the surface scratch of a force still sharpening itself in motion. You didn't just do what their bloodline couldn't. You reminded them of everything they wasted, the time, the tools, the access, the silence they filled with noise instead of growth. And now they'll never escape the comparison, because you exist, because your hours were enough to demolish their dynasties. And that truth doesn't die. It infects, it multiplies, it spreads like an uncomfortable question that never gets answered. How did someone outside of everything become the center of everything? You already know the answer. You didn't ask. You executed. You didn't study their way. You unlearned it. And when the world finally noticed, it was already too late to stop you. You did, in hours, what their entire bloodline couldn't do in centuries. And now, the future has your fingerprints.